You're listening to A Mighty Fortress, celebrating 180 years of Lutheranism in Australia.
A mighty fortress, it is our God, a trusty shield and weapon.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A Mighty Fortress. I'm your host, Jake Zabel, and welcome to the Fortress. On our last episode of A Mighty Fortress, I did an episode on the life of Pastor C.F.A.F. Shirmeister, the father of Lutheranism in the state of Queensland, Australia. On last episode, I gave a complete brief overview of his whole life, from his birth till his death. And on this episode, I want to focus on it's both his greatest achievement and his greatest blunder at the same time. On this episode, we're going to be looking at the church union of the Lutheran churches in Queensland. So Pastor Shirmeister's greatest challenge was trying to organise all the pastors and congregations of Queensland into a single united synod. Everard Lesky, in his book For Faith and Freedom, The Story of Lutherans and Lutheranism in Australia, 1838 to 1996, which is a book produced by the Friends of the Lutheran Archives down in Adelaide, and I'm pretty sure this book is still available. I will find a place where you can buy a copy of that, and I'll put it in the link of this episode description. So if you are interested in studying Lutheranism in Australia, that's a pretty good book. It's not 100% detailed and doesn't go into all the other non-LCA Lutheran synods post the 1966 union. But for the history of Lutheranism from 1938 up until the union of the LCA, it gives an excellent history of all the Lutheran churches in Australia. And from 1966 up to 1996, it gives an excellent history of the Lutheran Church of Australia. If you want to learn more about the non-LCA Lutheran churches in Australia, you can go to an episode I did a few weeks ago on the Lutherans of Oz, going through all the different Lutheran synods currently in Australia. Also, I did a 3-part YouTube series on Lutheranism in Queensland, and the last video goes through the history of Lutheranism in Queensland from 1966 onwards. And so in that video, I touch on a bunch of the other non-LCA Lutheran synods in Australia. I'll pop a link to that video in the episode description as well. But getting back to Pastor Shirmeister, Everard Lesky, in his book For Faith and Freedom, said that despite Shirmeister's energy, while Pastor Shirmeister had a great zeal and was really enthusiastic and had a lot of energy, despite all of this, he never had much of an opportunity to properly develop a strong knowledge and appreciation of the Book of Concord. Pastor Shirmeister, he was very different to the other Gosner missionaries in Australia in the fact that he'd actually read the Book of Concord. See, most of the Gosner missionaries, because they came from the Gosner Seminary, which was a non-denominational, more reformed seminary over in Germany, most of the Lutheran missionaries that came out of Gosner never actually ever read the Book of Concord. Pastor Shirmeister was a unique Gosner missionary in the fact that he actually had read the Book of Concord once in his life, at least once in his life. He'd actually sat down and read it. However, despite having been the only Gosner missionary to actually have read the Book of Concord, unlike the Hermannsburg pastors, he never really properly studied the Book of Concord. He knew of it, he read it, he knew parts of it, but Shirmeister just never got the opportunity to sit down and to properly study the Lutheran confessions. And this is mainly due to a lot of reasons, but chief among those is the fact that Shirmeister was just busy. He was more of a mission pastor than anything. And he was based mainly in Brisbane, but he also served congregations in Ipswich and Toowoomba, and he used to ride up the Queensland coast trying to go to outreach members and pastor to them as well. He was constantly spread thin working around Queensland, which is why he tried so hard to actually establish congregations and to call pastors to serve those congregations. And he tried so hard to get a unified synod so that the Queensland Lutherans could actually be served properly, so that there could be a bunch of pastors doing the work. So that wasn't just Shirmeister running back and forth having to look after everybody. But despite Shirmeister's lack of time to study the Book of Concord, he was a devout Lutheran. Pastor Haybart, in his writing, said that Shirmeister and Heine worked along positive Lutheran lines, unlike pastors like Houseman and others who weren't very Lutheran. They were more Baptist-y, Presbyterian kind of reform. See, Shirmeister always stood firm with the Lutheran Church. While serving as a missionary on the Chatham Islands, Shirmeister had been offered the financially beneficial chance to become an Anglican pastor by Bishop Selwyn. But Shirmeister turned down the offer because, despite his theological and missionary training, Shirmeister was a confessional Lutheran at heart and at all times was concerned with establishing and promoting the Church of the Reformation. Shirmeister even refused to attend a pastors' conference in Ipswich 1859, which sought to bring synodical unity, because many of the fellow pastors, mainly Pastor Houseman, supported the un-Lutheran practice of lay preaching. It was Shirmeister's emphasis on orthodoxy that antagonized some of his Gosner colleagues, particularly Pastor Houseman, who allowed laymen to preach and ordained some of them without any theological training. Brouwer, in his book, Under the Southern Cross, which is an excellent book on the history of the Elka in Australia. However, it is out of print at the current time, and you have to look for second-hand copies. They're very hard to come across, but if you can find one, definitely read it. Brouwer, in his history of the Elka, writes that there was an unbridgeable gulf between the rigid Lutheran orthodoxy of the Hermannsburg pastors and the very lax confessionalism of the Basil Gosner pastors. It was this huge gulf that Pastor Shirmeister desired to bridge. In order to achieve his goal of a single Lutheran synod in Queensland, Pastor Shirmeister had to unite the Hermannsburg pastors with the Gosner Basil pastors. And if anybody could bridge this gulf, Pastor Shirmeister was the perfect candidate, as he often fell directly in the middle of the two sides. Pastor Shirmeister was strongly confessional, and he cherished his Lutheran values, which gained him close friends in pastors Heine and Helmuth. However, Shirmeister considered the Hermannsburg pastors to be too rigid and too legalistic in their doctrine. His feelings towards the two groups can be seen in a letter that he wrote to Pastor Herman Hurlitz of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod in Victoria in 1877, a letter which I also translated, which can be found in my Shirmeister document on my Order of Knight George website. Pastor Shirmeister wrote to Pastor Hurlitz requesting his assistance and required a pastor from the Basil Seminary. This letter shows just how desperate Queensland was for pastors, since the letter shows that Shirmeister did not have a very high opinion of the Basil Seminary. He called Basil a confessionally loose seminary, and he used the words of John 1:46 to mock them, saying, "Can anything good come from Basil?" He even had to specify in his letter that if it was possible, could Basil send them a truly evangelical man of the Lutheran confessions, with a doctrine that could not be blown about by the winds or the favour of man. In this letter, Shirmeister makes reference to the two different Lutheran groups in Queensland. From the letter, it is obvious that Shirmeister doesn't consider himself belonging to either party. He accuses the Hermannsburg party of acting like papists. He calls them super-orthodox and says that they are on their way to Rome. In other words, he's calling them Romanists, that is, Lutherans who are heavily influenced by Roman Catholic doctrine. While at the same time he accuses the Gosner Basil Party, or as Pastor Shirmeister called them, the Houseman Party, as they were being led by Pastor Houseman, as being mystics. He says that the Houseman Party has fallen pretty far into enthusiasm. Shirmeister also complains about a young Pastor Hartwig, who belonged to the Houseman Party. Hartwig is described as a young preacher that despised study, and claimed that because he was so full of the Spirit and life that he preaches best if he has not prepared a sermon. Pastor Shirmeister called him an ignorant young man and said that Hartwig boasted in his ignorance based upon Matthew 11:25, which says, "Because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned and revealed them to little children." According to this letter, Shirmeister said that there was quite a controversy at the church at German Station due to Pastor Hartwig. Hartwig had originally been a layman in the parish whom Houseman had selected and placed in charge of the congregation. According to Pastor Shirmeister, Houseman had forced Hartwig upon the congregation. Pastors Berghardt, Houseman and Gaustad had selected Hartwig and placed him in charge of the German Station and Zemir congregations in 1873. And Zemir is in a suburb of Brisbane. Hartwig had operated under a prohibition period for 2 years as a lay preacher and was only ordained in 1875 as an actual pastor called to the office of the ministry. After the congregation could no longer endure the unwashed chatter of Pastor Hartwig, Pastor Houseman became very upset with the congregation at German Station. He also became furious with Pastor Shirmeister, who had taken care of the congregation since 1877 after Hartwig had taken a call to the Douglas parish. It was the German Station congregation that Shirmeister had sought a pastor for. His request was answered in the form of Pastor Ernst Otto Meyer, who arrived in Queensland in November 1877 and worked at the German Station and Zimri parish, and later extended his work to South Brisbane. He served here until 1886, when he accepted a call to Charter Towers and was replaced by Pastor Egan from New South Wales. In Shirmeister's letter, he states that he belonged to neither of the two parties in Queensland, and it is obvious from the letter that he caused himself to come under attack from both sides. He mentioned that the Houseman Party had accused him of not being spiritual, while the Hermannsburg Party had claimed that he was not orthodox. He boasts that none of these accusations could stand up against him and that he had bested both sides. On a more positive note, in this 1877 letter, Shirmeister comments on his friendship with Pastors Helmuth and Hainer. Shirmeister said that he had worked much on them in regards to fellowship and that they had conferences about conferences. However, despite these conferences about conferences, there was no fellowship intended, which caused Shirmeister deep grief. These three men had a very close relationship and worked hard for synodical unity. It is sad, though, that the parting of the two groups would sever this friendship between Shirmeister and Helmuth. In 1879, Pastors Shirmeister, Helmuth, and Hainer were joined by Pastors Meyer, Gosling, and Eberhard in a conference initiated by Gosling at Kirkheim, which is now modern-day Haigsley in Queensland. These 6 pastors met and bound themselves to the Lutheran confessions of 1850 and agreed to work together and to support one another in the ministry. The same group met again in March the following year to reaffirm their unity, but no further actions were ever taken. On November 28, 1883, Pastor Shirmeister called together a conference at North Brisbane of all Lutheran pastors in Queensland. Only about half of the pastors arrived. Present were Shirmeister, his companions Helmuth and Hainer, Pastor Gosling and Meyer, and also Pastors Peterson, Presler, Hua, and the two Cahoki brothers. That is Pastor Joachim and Johann Cahoki. A constitution was drawn up, and they all agreed to form the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland. However, the year of 1884 passed and no union occurred. But then, with the arrival of Pastor Saltman, came a revived desire for union. And on January 29th, 1885, a conference was held at Bethania. A constitution was drafted and approved, and the responsibility fell to Pastor Shirmeister and Saltman to arrange a time and place for the final union of all Queensland pastors. The Lutherans of the North became so close to becoming one unified synod, and it would have happened if it hadn't been for the mingling of Pastor Hurlitz. In 1883, Houseman had already joined Hurlitz in unity, and his congregation at Binglee had officially become part of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Victoria. So therefore, there was technically a Victorian Synod congregation in the state of Queensland. This wasn't like an altar pulpit fellowship. Pastor Houseman and the Binglee congregation were officially members of the Victorian Synod. Pastor Hurlitz had now come to Queensland in order to seek a further unity with all the pastors of Queensland and to establish a Queensland Synod so that the Victorian Synod could have fellowship with the Queensland Lutherans. He pushed Pastors Shirmeister and Heiner into a union with the less confessional pastors. Therefore, on June 9th, 1885, Pastors Shirmeister, Heiner, Houseman, Landbecker, Meyer, and Copas met at Bethania and formed the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland. Shirmeister was named as the president, and Heiner was named as the secretary, and the constitution of the synod was signed and approved and accepted. This synod may have been the less confessional synod, but their stance on Lutheranism rings out in the first clause of the Constitution. The Queensland Lutheran Synod joins the entire Lutheran Church in confessing the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testament as the Word of God, the only rule and guide of faith and life, and all the symbolic books of the Lutheran Church as the genuine presentation and exposition of the Word of God. Shirmeister even stated in his 1887 letter that the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland was not super orthodox like certain other groups in Australia, but that their synod was committed to the symbols of the Lutheran confessions, aka the Book of Concord. The Hermannsburg pastors had not even been invited to this conference at Bethania, and understandably, they refused any union with the now formed Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland. And so, on August 5th, 1885, 8 pastors met together and founded the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland. Ironically, their constitution was almost identical to the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland, since both constitutions were based on the one prepared by Pastors Shirmeister and Saltman in January of 1885. While Pastor Shirmeister would end up being the president of the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Queensland, Pastor Saltman was actually the first president of the United German and Scandinavian Lutheran Synod of Queensland. And thus, Queensland would now be home to 2 distinct Lutheran synods. Pastor Shirmeister had dreamed of seeing a united Queensland, but due to his rash decisions under the guidance of Pastor Hurlitz, he had created an even greater divide. But whatever mistakes Pastor Shirmeister had made, the Lutheran Church of Queensland must ever keep in grateful memory the name and life of Pastor Shirmeister. Thank you for listening to this episode of A Mighty Fortress. Hope you can join me again next time. I've been your host, Knight Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.